You thought your soulmate loved you. The truth is hard to accept. Stay with me and don't rush away from this, because what you're about to read may feel uncomfortable at first, but it's the kind of discomfort that leads to clarity instead of confusion. If this title pulled you in, it's not by accident. Something inside you already knows that what you felt wasn't fully matched, even if you tried for a long time not to admit it. You thought your soulmate loved you. Not casually. Not halfway. You believed it deeply, in a quiet and steady way. You believed it because of the connection you felt, the emotional closeness, the moments that felt intimate and real. You believed it because you don't give your heart lightly. When you love with intention, patience, and loyalty. And that's exactly why the truth is so hard to accept. Because accepting the truth doesn't just mean letting go of them. It means letting go of the story you built to survive the waiting. It means admitting that what you felt so strongly wasn't being carried with the same weight on the other side. There were moments that felt undeniable. Conversations that went deep. Silences that felt comfortable. Times when you felt seen in ways you hadn't before. You replay those moments now, wondering how something that felt so genuine could still leave you feeling unsure, unchosen, or emotionally alone. That question has kept you stuck. You may have told yourself they just needed time. That they were guarded. That their past made it hard for them to show love openly. You made space for their fears. You softened your needs. You waited without demanding clarity because you didn't want to pressure something that felt meaningful. You called it patience. You called it understanding. You called it love. But slowly, something started to feel off. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just small moments where your energy wasn't met. Where your effort felt heavier than theirs. Where you were the one checking in, initiating, holding space, adjusting expectations. You noticed it, but you pushed the feeling down because acknowledging it would mean facing a painful possibility. That they cared, but not enough to choose you fully. This is the part people don't talk about. The space between caring and committing. Between connection and consistency. Between emotional closeness and emotional responsibility. You were standing on one side of that space, reaching across it, hoping they would eventually step forward. They didn't. And that doesn't mean they never felt anything for you. That's what makes this truth so difficult. It wasn't black and white. It wasn't that they didn't care at all. It's that their care stopped where effort was required. Where clarity was needed. Where love asked them to be brave. You felt that hesitation, even when you tried to ignore it. You noticed how answers stayed vague when you asked about the future. How reassurance came without follow-through. How emotional availability showed up in moments but disappeared when consistency was needed. You told yourself not to read too much into it, but your body felt the imbalance long before your mind was ready to admit it. Your body knew. There were times you felt anxious without knowing why. Times when silence felt heavier than it should have. Times when you questioned yourself for wanting something so simple, to feel secure, chosen, and steady with someone you loved. You may have wondered if you were asking for too much. That question still hurts to think about, because it means you almost convinced yourself that your needs were the problem. They weren't. You weren't asking for perfection. You weren't asking for constant attention or dramatic promises. You were asking for presence. For honesty. For consistency. You were asking for love that didn't leave you guessing where you stood. And instead of receiving that, you learned how to wait. Waiting became your coping mechanism. You waited for them to be ready. You waited for clarity. You waited for effort to catch up to words. And while you waited, you kept showing up with the same depth, the same care, the same loyalty. That's not weakness. That's devotion. But devotion becomes painful when it's one-sided. This is the truth that hurts the most to accept. You didn't fail at love. You weren't wrong for believing. You just loved someone who couldn't meet you where you stood. They may have enjoyed you. They may have felt connected to you. They may have leaned on you emotionally. But love that doesn't translate into choice, effort, and accountability isn't love that can sustain a relationship. It's attachment. It's comfort. It's emotional closeness without commitment. And you deserve more than that. You might still be holding on to the version of them you saw in rare moments, the version that opened up, that made you feel special, that gave you just enough to keep hoping. That version felt real because it was real. But it wasn't consistent. And inconsistency, no matter how intense the moments are, slowly erodes trust. Love can't survive on moments alone. You started feeling like you had to be careful with your words. Careful not to ask too much. Careful not to scare them away. Careful not to seem needy for wanting clarity. You adjusted yourself to keep the connection intact. And that's where the cost shows up. Love shouldn't require you to shrink. The truth is hard to accept because it asks you to stop romanticizing struggle. It asks you to stop believing that patience alone will turn potential into reality. It asks you to admit that someone can feel deeply and still not love you in the way that shows up, stays, and builds. That realization feels like loss, but it's also relief. Relief because you no longer have to keep explaining their absence. Relief because you no longer have to wait for something to change. Relief because you can finally stop blaming yourself. You didn't imagine the connection. You didn't exaggerate the depth. You didn't love wrong. You loved honestly. And honesty deserves to be met, not managed. This truth may feel like it's breaking something inside you, but what it's really doing is clearing space. Space for self-respect. Space for clarity. Space for a kind of love that doesn't require endurance as proof. You're allowed to grieve this. Not just the person, but the future you imagined. The conversations you thought you'd have. The security you believed would come eventually. That grief is real, and it doesn't mean you're weak. It means you invested. But now, you're being asked to invest differently. Not by closing your heart. Not by becoming guarded or bitter. But by choosing yourself with the same loyalty you once gave them. This is only the beginning of that shift. You're not walking away empty-handed. You're walking away with truth. And truth, even when it hurts, is what finally sets you free. Stay here. This story isn't over. It's just becoming honest. Stay here and don't skim, because what unfolds now is the part most people try to rush through. This is where the truth you've already touched begins to echo through your everyday life. Not loudly. Quietly. In small moments when you least expect it. This is where you stop asking, "What happened?" and start noticing what it did to you. After you accept that they didn't love you in the way you loved them, something shifts internally. It's subtle at first. You still think about them. You still remember the warmth of certain moments. You still feel that strange pull in your chest when something reminds you of them. But underneath all of that, there's a new awareness forming. An awareness that says, "I was alone more often than I admitted." That awareness is heavy, because it reframes everything. You start remembering how often you waited for replies and told yourself not to check your phone. How often you were the one reaching out, initiating, keeping the connection alive. You remember the emotional labor you did quietly, reading between the lines, adjusting your expectations, explaining away your disappointment so you wouldn't have to face it. At the time, you thought that was love. You thought love meant being flexible, patient, endlessly understanding. You believed that if you just held space long enough, they would eventually step fully into it with you. But now, with the fog lifting, you can see how much you were carrying alone. You weren't just loving them. You were holding the relationship together with hope. That realization hurts, not because it makes you feel foolish, but because it makes you realize how much of yourself you set aside. How many times you silenced your own needs so the connection wouldn't feel threatened. How often you chose peace on the surface over honesty underneath. You start asking yourself hard questions now. Not accusatory ones, but honest ones. Questions like, why did I stay quiet when I felt unsure? Why did I accept inconsistency as something normal? Why did I wait for someone to choose me instead of choosing myself sooner? These questions don't come with immediate answers. They sit with you. They follow you into quiet moments. And instead of pushing them away, you begin to listen. You realize that a big part of why you stayed was hope. Hope is powerful. It can keep you warm in cold situations. It can help you endure. But hope, when it isn't grounded in action, can also keep you stuck. You hoped they would become ready. You hoped they would realize what they had. You hoped the connection would deepen if you just gave it more time. And because you're not someone who gives up easily, you stayed. There's compassion in that. And it's important you don't lose sight of it. You didn't stay because you didn't know your worth. You stayed because you saw worth in connection, in growth, in patience. You believed love was something that could be built with care. What you didn't realize then is that love cannot be built by one person alone. That's the truth that lands hardest now. You may start to feel anger, not explosive, not dramatic, but a slow-burning kind. Anger that they let you believe something deeper was forming when they knew they couldn't show up fully. Anger that they accepted your emotional availability without offering the same in return. Anger that they enjoyed the closeness without carrying the responsibility that comes with it. That anger doesn't make you bitter. It makes you honest. And honesty is uncomfortable when you've spent a long time softening the truth to protect someone else's feelings. You also begin to notice how the dynamic affected your sense of self. How you started questioning your instincts. How you wondered if you were too much for wanting clarity. Too emotional for wanting consistency. Too intense for wanting to feel secure. You weren't too much. You were asking the wrong person. That realization doesn't immediately stop the self-doubt, but it weakens it. Each time the thought arises, maybe I asked for too much, another voice answers more clearly now, I asked for what I was willing to give. And that matters. You gave presence. You gave honesty. You gave patience. You gave emotional depth. Wanting those things in return is not neediness. It's reciprocity. As this sinks in, you may feel a wave of grief that surprises you. Not just grief for the person, but grief for the version of yourself that kept waiting. The version that stayed hopeful even when the signs were there. The version that tried to make things work quietly so no one would feel uncomfortable. That version of you deserves kindness, not criticism. You don't shame yourself for staying. You don't rewrite history to make yourself look stronger. You acknowledge that you did the best you could with the understanding you had at the time. That's healing. You also start to see how uneven emotional dynamics can distort time. How waiting stretches days into weeks. How uncertainty makes moments feel heavier. How being emotionally invested without security drains you in ways you couldn't name back then. Now that you're no longer in it, your body begins to relax. Not all at once, but gradually. You sleep a little deeper. You breathe a little easier. You don't feel that constant low-level anxiety humming beneath the surface. You didn't realize how much tension you were holding until it started to release. That release feels unfamiliar. You might even mistake it for emptiness at first. You're so used to the emotional stimulation of hoping, waiting, and analyzing that calm feels strange. But calm isn't emptiness. It's peace reintroducing itself. You begin to notice how much emotional energy you have now. Energy that used to be spent on interpreting silence, managing disappointment, and convincing yourself to stay patient. That energy slowly returns to you, and you're not sure what to do with it at first. So you sit with it. And as you sit with it, you start to remember who you were before everything became about whether someone would finally meet you halfway. You remember your interests. Your humor. Your independence. Your ability to feel full without constantly looking outward. You're not becoming someone new. You're returning to yourself. There are still moments when you miss them. Missing doesn't disappear just because clarity arrives. Certain memories still feel warm. Certain connections don't vanish just because they weren't sustainable. That doesn't mean you should go back. It means you're human. But now, when you miss them, you don't romanticize the pain. You remember the whole picture. You remember the uncertainty. The imbalance. The emotional weight you carried alone. And that memory steadies you. You're also beginning to understand something deeper about love itself. Love is not proven by how long you can wait. It's not proven by how much you can endure. It's proven by how consistently two people choose each other in both words and actions. You were choosing. They were hesitating. That difference matters. You may still wish things had been different. That they had been ready. That timing had aligned. That effort had matched feeling. Those wishes don't make you weak. They make you honest about what you wanted. But wanting doesn't obligate you to stay where you're not met. This phase teaches you discernment. Not the kind that makes you guarded, but the kind that makes you clear. You begin to notice patterns faster. You recognize emotional unavailability sooner. You no longer confuse connection with commitment. You don't chase reassurance anymore. You watch behavior. And if behavior doesn't align, you don't argue with yourself about it. That's growth. You may feel a quiet sadness when you realize how much love you had to offer, and how it wasn't received in full. But alongside that sadness is pride. Pride in your capacity to love deeply. Pride in your willingness to be vulnerable. Pride in the courage it took to face the truth instead of clinging to illusion. You didn't close your heart. You educated it. And that education will guide you moving forward. You're not walking away bitter. You're walking away wiser. You're not losing faith in love. You're losing faith in love that requires you to disappear to sustain it. That distinction changes everything. You begin to imagine a different kind of future now. Not one where you're waiting to be chosen, but one where love feels mutual from the start. Where effort flows both ways. Where you don't feel the need to prove your worth or downplay your needs. That future doesn't feel urgent. It feels possible. And for the first time in a long time, possible feels enough. You're not healed completely. Healing isn't a finish line. But you're grounded. You're aware. You're no longer bargaining with reality. And that's where real change begins. Stay with this. You're not losing love. You're learning how it should feel. Stay with me in this space, because now you're standing at a quiet crossroads that doesn't look dramatic from the outside but feels heavy inside. This is where the truth you accepted starts changing the way you feel about yourself, not just about them. It's where the question slowly stops being, why didn't they love me the way I loved them, and becomes, why did I stay when my heart kept telling me something was missing? That question doesn't arrive to accuse you. It arrives to wake you up. You begin to notice how much you normalized emotional imbalance. How often you told yourself that love meant compromise, patience, and understanding, even when those things were costing you your sense of safety. You remember moments when your chest felt tight for no clear reason, when silence felt louder than words, when you smiled through conversations that left you feeling strangely empty afterward. At the time, you pushed those feelings aside. You didn't want to be difficult. You didn't want to seem demanding. You didn't want to lose what you had by asking for what you needed. So you learned to adapt. You learned to wait. You learned to accept partial presence and call it enough. Now, looking back, that hurts in a different way. Not because you regret loving them, but because you see how gently you abandoned yourself in the process. There's a deep sadness that comes with realizing you were carrying hope while they were carrying comfort. You were imagining a future while they were enjoying the moment. You were building something in your heart while they were keeping things open-ended so they wouldn't feel trapped. That imbalance didn't show up as cruelty. It showed up as vagueness. As mixed signals. As reassurance without commitment. As closeness that never quite turned into certainty. And uncertainty, over time, wears a person down. You may start to feel anger toward yourself, not harsh anger, but disappointment. Disappointment that you ignored your intuition. Disappointment that you waited for clarity instead of asking for it directly. Disappointment that you gave the benefit of the doubt so many times that you stopped trusting your own feelings. When that disappointment surfaces, it's important not to turn it into self-blame. You didn't stay because you were weak. You stayed because you were hopeful. You stayed because you believed love could grow if you nurtured it carefully enough. That belief came from a good place. It just wasn't matched by reality. Reality is this: love doesn't grow where it's not being tended by both people. It doesn't deepen where one person is always adjusting while the other remains unchanged. And it doesn't become secure when one heart is always waiting. Accepting that truth brings grief, but it also brings relief. Relief because you're no longer asking yourself what you could have done differently to make them stay. Relief because you're no longer wondering if you were too much. Relief because you can finally stop negotiating with silence. You may notice now how your body reacts differently to memories. Before, thinking about them might have sparked longing, anxiety, or a rush of emotion. Now, the feeling is more muted. Still tender, but steadier. The ache isn't sharp anymore. It's more like a dull awareness that something meaningful didn't become what you hoped it would. That awareness doesn't demand action. It doesn't pull you backward. It simply exists. And you let it. You begin to understand that closure doesn't always come from a conversation. Sometimes it comes from seeing the pattern clearly and deciding not to repeat it. Sometimes it comes from accepting that the explanation you want won't give you the peace you think it will. Peace comes from alignment, not answers. You also start noticing how your self-trust rebuilds slowly. You pay attention to your reactions now. If something feels off, you don't immediately override it with logic. You listen. You sit with it. You allow your feelings to inform you instead of dismissing them. That's a big change. You used to question yourself constantly. Now, you're beginning to trust that your needs make sense. That wanting consistency isn't unreasonable. That craving emotional safety isn't asking for too much. That desiring to be chosen openly isn't dramatic. It's human. There are moments when you feel a deep compassion for yourself. For the version of you who stayed hopeful. For the version of you who waited. For the version of you who believed in love even when it was confusing. That compassion is part of healing. You don't look back and think, I was foolish. You think, I was trying. And trying isn't something to be ashamed of. As this understanding settles, you begin to feel less attached to the idea that they were your soulmate. Not because the connection wasn't intense, but because you now see that a soulmate wouldn't leave you feeling unsure of your place. A soulmate wouldn't require you to quiet your needs to stay connected. A soulmate wouldn't keep you suspended in hope without meeting you in effort. That reframing doesn't erase what you felt. It contextualizes it. You start to see that what you experienced was a deep connection, but not a sustainable one. And sustainability matters more than intensity when it comes to love that lasts. You also notice how your emotional world feels calmer now. Not joyful all the time, but balanced. You're no longer riding emotional highs and lows based on someone else's availability. Your mood isn't tied to messages, responses, or reassurance. You feel more like yourself again. That sense of self begins to expand. You invest more energy into your own life, your routines, your interests. Not as a distraction, but as a reconnection. You remember what it feels like to enjoy things without wondering if you should share them with someone who may or may not show up. You stop waiting to be invited into certainty. There may still be moments when you imagine how things could have been if they had chosen differently. Those thoughts come naturally. They don't mean you want to go back. They mean you're human and capable of envisioning possibility. But now, those possibilities don't hook you. You understand that wishing someone had been different doesn't mean they were wrong. It means they weren't right for you. That distinction brings peace. You also begin to notice how your expectations for love shift. You're not looking for fireworks anymore. You're looking for steadiness. You're not looking for someone to complete you. You're looking for someone who complements the wholeness you're rebuilding. You don't rush connection. You don't overinvest early. You let people reveal themselves. You watch how they handle consistency, communication, and care. And if someone doesn't meet you there, you don't take it personally. That's growth. You're learning that walking away from what doesn't serve you isn't loss. It's protection. It's choosing long-term peace over short-term comfort. It's trusting that love shouldn't require you to feel anxious, uncertain, or unseen. You're no longer afraid of being alone. You're afraid of being in something that makes you feel alone. That fear is healthy. You may still carry tenderness for them, and that's okay. Tenderness doesn't mean attachment. It means you allowed yourself to feel something real. You don't regret that. You respect it. But you no longer build your future around it. Your future now feels open in a different way. Not full of expectation, but full of possibility. You're not chasing an outcome. You're aligning with a feeling. The feeling of being safe, valued, and reciprocated. That alignment guides you quietly. You don't announce your boundaries. You live them. You don't demand consistency. You expect it. You don't convince anyone of your worth. You know it. This shift didn't come easily. It came from sitting with discomfort. From facing disappointment honestly. From letting go of a story that once gave you hope but no longer gave you peace. You didn't lose love. You learned how it should feel. And that learning will stay with you, shaping your choices, protecting your heart, and guiding you toward connections that don't ask you to wait in uncertainty. You're not closing a chapter with bitterness. You're closing it with understanding. And understanding is what allows you to move forward without carrying the weight of what didn't work. You're still open. Still capable of deep love. Just no longer willing to lose yourself in the process. That's not a loss. That's growth. Stay with me here, because this is where the shift becomes undeniable. Not dramatic. Not loud. But deeply real. This is where you stop circling the pain and start living from the wisdom it left behind. You don't wake up one morning magically healed. Instead, you wake up different. Quieter inside. Clearer. Less willing to lie to yourself just to feel close to someone. You begin to realize that the hardest part was never losing them. It was losing the version of yourself who believed that love meant waiting silently, hoping patiently, and adjusting endlessly. Letting go of that version feels strange, almost like shedding a skin you wore for too long. It protected you once. but it no longer fits. You notice how your internal dialogue has changed. You're no longer replaying conversations, wondering what you should have said differently. You're no longer imagining scenarios where, if you had just been a little more understanding or a little less honest, things might have worked out. Those mental loops don't trap you anymore. Not because you don't care, but because you see clearly now. You see that you weren't met. And no amount of rewording your needs would have changed that. There's a kind of grief that comes with clarity. It's not the grief of heartbreak, but the grief of realization. The grief of understanding that the love you were offering didn't land because the other person wasn't in a place to receive it. You weren't too much. You were simply more present than they were capable of being. That realization stops you from romanticizing the struggle. You begin to see how much strength it took to hold on, and how much more strength it took to let go. Letting go wasn't an act of giving up. It was an act of self-respect. You stopped choosing the possibility of love over the reality of how you felt. And how you felt mattered. You felt uncertain. You felt anxious. You felt like you were waiting for something that never fully arrived. Those feelings weren't flaws in you. They were signals. Signals that something was off, even if you couldn't name it at the time. Now you can name it. You were in a connection that relied on your emotional flexibility to survive. You were the one bending. The one hoping. The one filling in gaps with understanding. And slowly, that flexibility became exhaustion. You're not exhausted anymore. You notice how your nervous system responds now. There's less tension in your body. Less bracing for disappointment. Less anticipation that leads nowhere. You're not on edge waiting for someone else to decide how close they want to be. You feel grounded. This grounding changes how you move through your days. You're more present. More intentional. You don't rush moments. You don't fill space just to avoid silence. Silence doesn't feel threatening anymore. It feels honest. You also begin to notice how differently you relate to memories of them. They don't pull you under. They don't trigger the same ache. You can acknowledge what was good without ignoring what was missing. That balance feels mature, even if it took pain to get there. You're no longer idealizing them. You see them as they were. Someone who mattered, but who couldn't meet you at the depth you were offering. That doesn't make them a villain. It makes them human. And it makes you free. Freedom, in this stage, doesn't feel like excitement. It feels like steadiness. Like not having to convince yourself anymore. Like not having to explain away red flags. Like trusting your inner voice instead of silencing it. You trust yourself now. That trust is built slowly, through small choices. You notice it when you say no without over-explaining. When you walk away from conversations that feel draining instead of engaging out of obligation. When you don't chase emotional availability. When you don't wait for reassurance. You don't test people anymore. You let them show you who they are. And you believe what they show you. This belief isn't cynical. It's grounded. You're no longer giving people potential credit they haven't earned through action. You're no longer mistaking chemistry for compatibility. You're no longer confusing attachment with love. That discernment didn't come from theory. It came from experience. You felt what it's like to love deeply and still feel alone. You felt what it's like to hope endlessly without receiving clarity. You felt what it's like to give someone access to your heart without them taking responsibility for it. You won't do that again. Not because you're closed off, but because you're awake. You begin to realize that love isn't supposed to be confusing. It's not supposed to make you doubt your worth. It's not supposed to require you to wait indefinitely for someone to decide if you matter. Love shows up. It shows up in consistency, in presence, in effort, in the way someone considers your feelings without being asked, in the way they choose you when it's inconvenient, not just when it's easy. You didn't get that before. And now, instead of longing for it from the same place, you've raised the standard for what you allow into your life. This doesn't make you rigid. It makes you selective. You don't feel rushed to find someone new. You're not searching to fill a void. The void you felt before came from emotional imbalance, not from being alone. Now that balance is restored, solitude feels peaceful instead of lonely. You enjoy your own company again. You also notice how your relationships with others begin to shift. You show up more honestly. You're less afraid of being misunderstood because you're no longer trying to be everything to everyone. You express yourself without cushioning your words to avoid discomfort. If someone can't handle your honesty, you don't take it as rejection. You take it as alignment, or lack of it. That understanding saves you time and energy. You begin to understand that the love you're meant for won't ask you to shrink. It won't ask you to wait silently. It won't ask you to sacrifice your emotional safety for closeness. It will meet you. And until it does, you're okay. That okayness isn't resignation. It's self-respect. You might still feel moments of tenderness toward the person you thought was your soulmate. Tenderness doesn't mean attachment. It means you allowed yourself to feel something real. You don't regret that. You honor it. But you no longer build your future around it. You also realize something important about timing. Timing didn't ruin the connection. Readiness did. Emotional availability did. Capacity did. And those things are not controlled by love alone. You can't love someone into being ready. That truth once hurt deeply. Now it feels grounding. You no longer fantasize about how things could have worked out, if only. You understand that, if only, keeps you trapped in a version of reality that doesn't exist. You choose to live in what is. What is, right now, is clarity. You are clear about what you need. You are clear about what you won't accept. You are clear about the difference between love that excites you and love that sustains you. That clarity doesn't make you immune to pain. But it makes you resilient. You're no longer afraid of loving again. You're simply unwilling to love in a way that costs you your peace. You've learned that love should add to your life, not drain it. And that lesson stays with you. It informs every decision. It shapes every boundary. It protects the softest parts of you. You didn't come through this experience hardened. You came through it refined. More honest. More grounded. More aligned with yourself. The truth was hard to accept because it dismantled an illusion you once needed. But now that the illusion is gone, what remains is something far stronger. Self-trust, self-respect, and a quiet confidence that you don't need to be chosen to be whole. You already are. And when love comes again, real love, it won't feel like waiting. It won't feel like guessing. It won't feel like uncertainty wrapped in hope. It will feel like home. Until then, you stand steady, clear-eyed, open-hearted, and deeply rooted in the truth you once resisted, but now live by. That's not an ending. That's arrival. Stay here with me, because this is the place where everything finally settles into your body, not just your mind. This is no longer about understanding what happened or explaining it to yourself in 100 different ways. This is about how you live differently now, how you breathe, how you choose, how you love, and how you protect your own heart without closing it. You begin to notice that the past doesn't grip you the way it used to. It still exists, but it doesn't pull you backward. It doesn't ask you to fix it or reinterpret it. It simply sits where it belongs, in the past. That alone feels like freedom, even if you don't celebrate it out loud. There's a quiet confidence growing in you. Not the kind that announces itself or proves anything, but the kind that comes from knowing you survived something that once felt impossible to let go of. You don't need validation for that. You feel it in how steady you are now. You no longer replay conversations in your head late at night. You no longer imagine what you'd say if they suddenly reached out. That urge to explain yourself, to be understood by them specifically, has faded. Not because your need to be understood disappeared, but because you no longer need it from someone who couldn't meet you fully. That realization is deeply grounding. You start to recognize how much of your emotional energy used to live outside of you. How much attention you gave to reading signals, interpreting silence, waiting for reassurance. That energy has returned home now. And when it does, you're surprised by how much space there is inside you. Space to rest. Space to think clearly. Space to feel without panic. You're not filling that space with distractions. You're letting it exist. You're letting yourself be with yourself in a way you couldn't before because you were always emotionally leaning towards someone else. That leaning is gone. And in its place is balance. You notice how your standards have shifted, not upward in a demanding way, but inward in an honest one. You don't ask, "Do they like me?" anymore. You ask, "Do I feel safe here?" You don't ask, "How do I keep this connection?" You ask, "Is this connection nourishing me?" Those questions change everything. You also notice how your body responds more quickly now. When something feels off, you don't ignore it. You don't intellectualize it. You trust it. That trust didn't come naturally, it was earned through experience. Experience taught you that anxiety isn't excitement. Experience taught you that inconsistency isn't mystery. Experience taught you that silence isn't depth. Those lessons weren't gentle, but they were necessary. You begin to feel proud of yourself, not in a loud way, but in a quiet, grounded way. Proud that you didn't harden. Proud that you didn't become cynical. Proud that you allowed yourself to feel fully and still chose growth over bitterness. That pride feels steady. You also realize that forgiveness has happened, not as a decision you made one day, but as a process that unfolded naturally. You no longer feel the need to blame them or yourself. You see the situation clearly, two people at different levels of emotional readiness. You didn't lose because you loved. They didn't win because they walked away. It simply wasn't aligned. That clarity dissolves resentment. You may still feel tenderness when you think of them. Tenderness is not weakness. It's evidence that your heart is capable of depth. You don't need to erase that tenderness to move forward. You just don't let it guide your choices anymore. You've learned the difference. You also begin to understand how deeply you value reciprocity now. Not just in romantic connections, but in all relationships. You're less available for dynamics where you give more than you receive. You don't keep explaining your needs hoping someone will finally understand. You explain once. You observe. You decide. That's not cold. That's clear. You no longer overextend to earn closeness. You let closeness build naturally or not at all. You don't feel rejected when something doesn't progress. You feel informed. That sense of being informed instead of rejected is powerful. It changes how you see yourself. You no longer internalize someone else's limitations as your shortcomings. You understand that attraction doesn't equal capacity, and interest doesn't equal readiness. This understanding protects your peace. You also notice how much calmer your inner world feels. There's less mental noise. Less emotional turbulence. You're not constantly checking in with yourself asking, "Am I okay?" because you are. That doesn't mean life is perfect. It means you're regulated. You start enjoying simple moments again without the undercurrent of emotional uncertainty. You laugh more freely. You focus more easily. You don't feel like part of you is always somewhere else, waiting. You're here now. Being present becomes easier because you're no longer split between what is and what you hope will be. That split used to drain you. Now, your energy feels unified. You also begin to feel excitement again, but it's different. It's not tied to a person or outcome. It's tied to possibility. To the idea that the love you want exists because you now know how it should feel. That excitement doesn't rush you. It grounds you. You understand now that the connection you thought was your soulmate wasn't meant to last, but it was meant to teach. It taught you boundaries. It taught you discernment. It taught you self-respect. And those lessons will shape every relationship you enter from here on out. You didn't go through this for nothing. You also see clearly why staying would have cost you more than leaving ever did. Staying would have required you to keep minimizing yourself. To keep waiting. To keep accepting uncertainty as normal. Leaving gave you yourself back. That's not loss. That's recovery. You no longer measure love by intensity or longing. You measure it by steadiness, by how your body feels around someone, by whether your life expands or contracts in their presence. That measurement feels intuitive now. You don't worry about being alone. You worry about being in something that makes you feel alone. And that distinction keeps you aligned. You begin to trust that the love meant for you won't require you to prove anything. It won't ask you to shrink. It won't confuse you. It won't make you question your worth. It will meet you where you are. And until it does, you're not waiting in emptiness. You're living fully. Building a life that doesn't revolve around someone else's availability. You've stopped orbiting. You've come back to center. That center feels strong. You don't announce your growth. You live it. People may notice that you seem calmer, clearer, less reactive. You don't explain why. You don't need to. Your peace speaks for itself. You also realize that this experience didn't take something away from you. It refined you. It sharpened your intuition. It strengthened your boundaries. It deepened your understanding of love. You're not afraid of loving again. You're simply unwilling to lose yourself in the process. That's not fear. That's wisdom. As this chapter fully closes, it doesn't slam shut. It settles. Gently. Honestly. Without drama. You don't feel the need to mark the ending. You just move forward differently. And that difference shows in everything. You're not chasing love. You're not chasing validation. You're not chasing closure. You're aligned. Aligned with yourself. Aligned with your needs. Aligned with the truth you once resisted but now live by. You didn't lose your soulmate. You gained yourself. And that gain changes the rest of your life in ways you don't even fully see yet, but you feel it. Deeply. Steadily. Without doubt. This is not the end of your story. It's the moment you finally stop abandoning yourself inside it.
You also notice that your body react differently to inconsistency. Before you try to rationalize it, you made excuses, you gave people to benefit of the doubt at the expense of your own peace. Now inconsistency registers as information, not as something to fix but as something to note. And when you note it, you adjust accordingly. You don't argue with yourself anymore. That internal argument used to exhaust you, the back and forth between what you felt and what you hoped, between what your institution was telling you and what your heart wanted to believe. That noise is gone now. What remains is clarity, calm, alignment. You trust yourself. That trust changes everything.